can start. Hello, everybody. My name is Manuela Gerloff. I'm head of the Humanities and Social Sciences editorial teams at de Gruyter, and I will be representing the non-profit de Gruyter Foundation today. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second conversation in our series of discussions called Humanities for Humans, organized in partnership with 1014. The series brings together scholars from a variety of academic fields to help generate a better understanding of what the humanities are and what role they can play in today's complex world.
And I'm Katja Donovan, Executive Director at 1014. Today's transatlantic conversation about climate change will explore views of human relations to the Earth from various disciplines, such as indigenous law, geography, and art. While the numbers on climate change can pitch us into despair, our scholars today will talk about imagination, hope, and their belief that it is possible to change our behaviors in interacting with our environment in a more sustainable way.
Before we get started, I would like to thank Irene Kacandes, curator and moderator of the series, and today's speakers, Professor Harriet Hawkins and Professor Rebecca Tsosie. Thank you so much for generously offering your time and expertise to this project. With that, I hand over to Irene Kacandes, Professor of German Studies and Comparative Literature at Dartmouth, who is not only series editor at de Gruyter, but also a 1014 board member. Thanks again, Irene, for introducing our experts and moderating today's discussion.
Thanks so much for that welcome and introduction to the series, as well as to today's topics, Dr. Gerloff and Dr. Donovan. A very warm welcome to our online audience. Good evening to you, good day, and good morning to you on both sides of the Atlantic and across this North American continent. Please put your questions into the chat box as they occur to you, and I will pose them to our experts as we have time for. I hope audience members have also seen the list of readings to help you pursue our topic beyond this session, which, as you know, given its length, can only provide some guidelines for thinking and imagining anew. So let me introduce our humanities scholars who are speaking with us today. Professor Harriet Hawkins joins us from England, specifically from Royal Holloway, University of London. She is an expert in GeoHumanities, a field located at the intersection of the academic study of geography and the creative arts and the humanities. Her scholarly work finds expression in the production of books and articles, and also in perhaps more unexpected collaborations with practicing artists and gallerists to create artworks, exhibitions, and installations. Professor Rebecca Tsosie joins us from the American Southwest. She is a Regents Professor and the Morris K. Udall Professor of Law at the James E. Rogers College of Law at the University of Arizona. In addition to legal studies, her scholarship encompasses the fields of philosophy, sustainability, and indigenous studies. At Arizona State University, she served as Vice Provost for Inclusion and Community Engagement, and also as the first faculty executive director of ASU's Indian Legal Program. More information about our experts has also been put into the chat. Welcome warmly to you both. Let's get this conversation started. Rapid melting of the world's glaciers, the breaking off of gigantic chunks of the Arctic and the Antarctic ice shelves, horrific wildfires in California, Siberia, around the Mediterranean and South America, torrential rains, flooding, mudslides, rising sea levels, alarming biodiversity loss. These are only a few examples of the catastrophic damage to planet Earth that we read and hear about daily. Perhaps the only good aspect of this accelerating devastation is that a majority of the world's population finally seems to accept that climate change is real. Are there ways to stop the slow destruction of the Earth or slow the destruction of the Earth? Will those measures come from governments, from industry, from the United Nations, from meetings like COP27 that took place in November, or the Conference on Biodiversity taking place at this very moment, just north of where I am in Montreal, Canada. To be sure, hundreds, if not thousands, of policymakers, scientists, and journalists are offering us valuable data and possible solutions. We're gathered here today, however, not to learn the latest numbers or technological solutions. It's ludicrous to think we could even list these in a single hour. Rather, I've asked our two scholars to share their thoughts with us about productive framings and possible new frameworks for how to date we ordinary folks have been asked to think about climate change. So my first question, Professor Hawkins and Professor Tsosie, concerns that phrase climate change and the similarly frequently heard phrase climate or environmental crisis. As even my briefest of introductions reveals, those phrases have been serving us as shorthand for a whole host of complicated, interrelated, and urgent problems. So focusing for a moment on language, I want to ask each of you, in what ways might the phrases climate change and climate crisis be misleading or actually counterproductive? Do they prevent us from seeing something important about what's going on? Are there other words or phrases that might not shut us down and rather lead our thoughts and hopefully our actions in productive directions? Professor Hawkins, would you like to go first?
That would be great. Thank you. Thank you, Irene, and thanks for such a great, productive opening question. And thank you to, of course, the sponsors of the events, and also Rebecca. It's a real honor to be in conversation with you. I'm really excited to see where we go with all this brilliant topic. Climate change and climate crisis, I mean, weighty words. And I'm sure I don't have to persuade anyone who's obviously tuning in to hear us talk about humanities for humans that the words we use to name our issues really matter. They really matter. For me, when I think about these phrases, climate or environmental change, climate crisis, emergency. As a geographer, I think about questions of scale, of space, and of time. I think about how the ideas of climate might help us at once think about the kind of huge scale of the issue. After all, this is a global issue, with globally uneven consequences, and of course causes. And one whose temporalities are, of course, those of the long duration, climate being measured over more like 30 years, rather than weather with that kind of immediacy. So while the grandeur of climate change may be apt for the scale of the problem, on the flip side, perhaps this grandeur risks also being really disempowering and alienating. After all, if we're talking about something that's so global and over such a long duration, what could that possibly mean for us in the here and now? And how could people like little old me affect it? I think it's perhaps important too not to overlook that second word that's always kind of comes with climate, that word change, crisis, or sometimes, of course, emergency. And I recently read somewhere, and I'm sure many of you saw this, that newspapers have been asked to stop using the word change as it seems a bit too mundane, not quite emotive enough. Things just change, shift happens. But crisis or emergency requires us to assemble now, implies a kind of value judgment, and assumes a sort of temporal horizon of action. We need to, indeed we must, act now if it's an emergency. And so I think there's, of course, power in this assertion of the need to act now. That we do well when we think about these words not to jettison that power, not least because so many of us, of course, don't live on the front lines of climate change. We don't always have to live with those daily reminders of the challenges, and many of us are isolated from those effects by privilege and geography. I also remember talking to a climate science colleague of mine a number of years ago about the evolution of that term Anthropocene. And he said that while he had some scientific misgivings about its origins, he could recognize the important work that those kinds of bonding, branding words could do, how they could provide rallying calls around which we could assemble publics and help kind of catalyze change. And I think I have a lot of sympathy with that. In my work, I've been exploring this idea of Earth futures alongside ideas like climate crisis to signal what I think is that profound need for imagining and bringing about other futures for the Earth. And then that the path of the Western world seems to kind of have tracked us down right now. But Earth futures is, of course, just another phrase. And again, one not without challenges. Whose futures do I mean here? Whose Earths? And what about that temporal orientation? Does it risk disavowing the lessons we might learn from the past, or distracting us by implying kind of future horizons away from the problems faced in the present? or even writing out those cultures whose current ways of being might already be cultivating better futures for us. And I've been thinking a lot more recently about some of these words alongside the work of my current collaborators, who's a creative writer and theorist of language called Eva Barbarossa. And Eva's work explores different words used for the underground or the subsurface. And she's been reminding me of the need to interrogate the entangled origins of our languages and our worldviews or our cosmologies, and how, if we seek to make space for other kinds of cosmologies and other ways of relating to the world that those might bring for us, we need to find other kinds of languages through which to do so. And so that makes me pause and visit again those phrases like climate change, crisis, and so on, and how they very much shape the kinds of worldly orientations we have.
That's wonderful and very, very helpful launch. Rebecca, Tsosie, would you like to take it now and share some of your initial thoughts about these phrases?
Thank you so much, Irene. I am just delighted to be here, and I thank you and the sponsors for convening this discussion, which is very timely and very meaningful. And I want to commend my colleague, Harriet, on your work, which is so important and very illuminating in the ways that you are putting together the language and the phrases. So I'm going to respond, I think, to some of the ideas that you have so artfully raised here. So I think that referring back to the language, the phrase climate change in and of itself is not scary. Right? The climate has changed over the life of the Earth in dramatic ways, and we know this from science. Science tells us this, and so people have a sense of studying that long trajectory of the Earth's history and finding comfort in the fact that this is natural, that something is happening. But you alluded to that concept of the Anthropocene, which I think is quite contested in some spaces. Because it really suggests that we're in an era like no other because of the rapid and unprecedented rate of climate change in a relatively short space, from industrialization through globalization, through these vast explorations of the Earth's subsurface into fossil fuel energy at a rate that is causing a crisis. Well, what is the crisis? The crisis is human action, the Anthropocene, that is causing global warming at a rapid and unprecedented rate, where the Earth really cannot regenerate, and we're starting to see seasonal patterns that we've never seen, and climate events like the bomb cyclones or whatever, climate events that have never happened in the places that they are happening. So when we look to Western thought, and here, I think that the tendency in the law, and I'm a lawyer, so I'll refer to the law, is to de-link humans from their environment. They did that, for example, in the Wilderness Act. The wilderness is a place with no people, and it's a place that we have a duty to preserve. And then we have endless fights in the Southwest and Arizona and Utah over how much of the wilderness we actually can afford to preserve. And the rest of it is going to go to fossil fuel exploration, right? So we're not thinking in alignment with our economies and our politics and our law that really is generated toward relatively short-term gain. That's what we get from fossil fuels. We get short-term gain, and the expense, the cost of that is the part that is at a crisis level. So do I think the term climate change is suitable? And I'm going to take a little bit different argument. I'm going to say we have a global consensus in the UN framework on climate change, which the US did sign on to, as did 198 other nations. And that is why we have these annual convenings of the Conference of Parties. That is why we have the Paris Agreement. It all stems to a global consensus on many of the things that we have just acknowledged in our conversation, Harriet. There's now a global consensus of nation states on that. And the Western science model is supporting that in the regular assessments of the climate that ensue. So if it's measurable, concrete, And the topic of global agreement, I think it is useful, but then it's incumbent on us to explore the relationship of human beings to their environment. And that's where the work that I've done on human rights and Indigenous peoples' rights will come into bear. But I want to get to some of the other questions that you have, Irene, and just kind of offer those comments to start.
That's very, very helpful. Thank you. And I want to give Professor Hawkins a moment to respond first before I make any comments. Harriet, do you have a direct response that you'd like to give?
No, I think we agree. It's really, I think that the power of that global consensus and the ability that offers to kind of get behind such important issues on a kind of collective stage is really, really vital. So, I mean, I think I'll just let you kind of continue through with your questions. Thank you.
Okay, great. So let me then observe for both of you, though in a slightly different framework, and both frameworks I think are really helpful to us. You've both noticed that the connection to humans and to human agency is actually left out when we just think about climate change, right? Whether we think about the meaning of climate or the meaning of change, somehow there's no agency, no one's responsible for it. Okay, and that placing in the context of the larger historical epics, right, of more than 1 billion years of the Earth, also indicate to us not that humans are doing anything, and yet we know they very much are, and that's the consensus that you were talking about, Rebecca. So let's get down then into the weeds. What happens when we do put humans and human agency back into it? What happens when we don't think of the wilderness as a place that is absent of humans, but also absent of life in its abundance? What do we need to put back into this discussion that somehow disappears when we just hear over and over again climate change or climate crisis, right? I am actually a scholar, not of this field, but of the Holocaust. And the word Holocaust gets used a little bit similarly. It's meant to cover a very large number of different things, not just what actually occurred in, say, the extermination camps. So when we think about climate change, to stay with our today's topic, what disappears? What do we need to bring into focus? What do we want to bring to our audience right now? Either of you, welcome to start. Someone, do you want to jump in, Rebecca, first?
Sure. So I think the follow-up thought to that question about human agency is to say that under Western thought, we tend to think of rights. So corporations have rights to engage in economic discourse, and individuals have rights to engage in labor and to, cultivate their land as property. So we're in that rights model, and the government has sort of a passive role. It kind of keeps the peace, but it doesn't really take away your property rights. That's the subject of endless lawsuits. And that concept of liability or responsibility is a tort-based concept in the common law, right? So under a nuisance cause of action, for example, if I do something on my land and it affects my neighbor to the point that I take away his use and enjoyment, then that is a problem and he can sue me. That whole model does not work for climate harm. And so that is where we're stuck as a global society, because we're still in the common law of liability, property rights, and tort. And yet we know from the lawsuits that have been filed that those causes of action are not going to work to curtail the level of human activity that is causing these tremendous impacts. And so the problem is one of not seeing relationality in a way that is premised on an active moral agency of human beings with respect to their environment. And so we might say that the environmental ethics of America has been very utilitarian. Get out there, prior appropriation in water law, get out there and start putting it to beneficial use. It doesn't matter if you waste it all. Same thing with mineral estates for a vast amount of history. That ethical model, when we look at other ways of knowing, and my work really delves into global Indigenous people's rights. When you look at all of those Indigenous cultures, they're place-based cultures. They view themselves in an ethical relationship with their place, land, and water. And so that is a way to conform human behavior into something that will allow for the survival of people in place in a multi-generational format. And so when we talk about intergenerational rights, that is embedded in Indigenous environmental ethics, even though they're culturally very distinct peoples, but they're place-based. And that is something that we do not have in Western thought. So I would argue that that is something that we need to build into our model.
Wonderful. And I think geography is all about place in addition to other things, of course. So Harriet, why don't you just respond to that?
Yeah, no, I'd love to. I think, Rebecca, that's just really wonderfully put and really fascinating to kind of hear you talk through that relationship between law, rights, ethics, and kind of Indigenous ways of relating to place. And certainly place is one of the kind of geographical primitives, I guess, we think of my discipline, and certainly something that we think through and teach with our students really early on. And I think one of the questions that certainly those of us who teach on my side of the Atlantic are thinking through a lot more is how can we take up work by kind of the work that people like yourself do and other kinds of scholars who work on kind of Indigenous communities and think through those understandings of place. I guess the specific angle I come at it with my particular kind of lens on is this question of what is it that something like GeoHumanities can do? So as a geographer, it's these questions of place, space, and environment that kind of tend my mind. But as someone who also kind of works within and across the humanities and is a humanities scholar, it's the question for me of what is it that in particular art, because I work as a kind of art historian, theorist, and also collaborate with practitioners, what is it that art can do to help us think through these questions of place and relationality and environmental ethics? How might the kinds of qualities and capacities of artists and the work and the way they help us to relate to the world give us another kind of way of bringing some of these other sorts of ways of relating to place and environment into our worldviews? So to use some kind of examples from some of the work I've done, I've been really interested in playing around with ideas of words like sensing and attuning and imagining and speculating to think through the kinds of vocabularies for how artists and artworks may kind of help us develop some of these expanded, by us here, I mean, people like myself living in cities like London, Western people with particular kinds of worldviews. So I've got this wonderful colleague in my department who's a geographer and an artist called Sasha Engelman. And she's part of this great collaboration called Open Weather. And I'd encourage everyone to look it up on Instagram or your favorite social media, or they've got a brilliant website. And what Sasha and the Open Weather team do is build a kind of global network of individuals using amateur radio kit. So they train individuals to use these amateur radio sets with antennae. And then using these antennae, they help them tune in to the weather satellites. And then using these antennae, they get the weather satellite, they basically create these extraordinary images on laptop computers that you'd normally expect to see on kind of our National Weather Agency's websites. And here they are being created on laptops in the middle of kind of communities who are living in Argentina or some of the places where Sasha's been working, and also recently done some work in Korea. So there's the incredible ways that she works with these radio antennae to intercept the kind of satellite signals. But in doing so, she and her kind of community of collaborators also have to attune themselves to the kind of changes in air patterns and the changes in weather to know how to make these satellites their antennae pick up these satellite images. And so in doing so, they become more attuned to the world around them. They learn how to read these weather patterns through their bodies as they're standing on the tops of buildings, on their balconies in London during lockdown, trying to sense these satellites. And they then produce these incredible images. And what's been really wonderful is to see how the work of this kind of network, this global network, has evolved through the generation of aesthetic images that sit in gallery spaces into this kind of set of images that is used as kind of environmental activism, that becomes a kind of alternative open source way for communities to generate data sets, images of the earth, images of land changes that can then be mobilized for different kinds of political causes. I'm going to stop there because I could go on with lots of examples, and I'm sure everyone in the audience can also think of some themselves. But I think the potential of art to help us build and attune to some of these place-based relations is just really fascinating.
So I'm just going to throw out a few words that I want our audience to have picked up on. You used the word attunement, and Rebecca, you also talked about ways of knowing. And I want to add imagination there, which I know is something that both of you have thought quite a lot about. It seems to me that this idea of attuning to what's actually going on has been a huge part of Indigenous ways of knowing and of the relationship to the earth and the environment. And Rebecca, I was wondering if you wanted to share a little more of your own sense of how we Westerners, if I could use that for a moment anyway, could learn how to be more attuned to the value of Indigenous ways of knowing. That seems to be something that's only entered certain parts of this discussion and not other parts of this discussion. Would you like to pick it up there?
Absolutely. And I want to thank Harriet for that fascinating example of the satellites. I think that is just a wonderful example of human imagination and ingenuity. And so I really like to think of imagination as a space within our human consciousness that is associated with knowledge. There's an association, it's not the same thing, but that space of human consciousness is something that I think I would have to say Indigenous peoples have a profound appreciation for. In fact, if you go back to creation stories, very oftentimes they'll posit that the very creation of the earth was the product of language and thought. You know, that was prior to the material form of creation. And so it's very interesting to see how we as a human society today, we get very fixated on measuring, for example, the levels of greenhouse gases. And then one of our climate assessments, the terrestrial climate assessment, I think it was 2018, if I'm not mistaken, it was the first time that scientists measured what is going on with the land, with the species on the land, with the ocean environment and the species in the ocean. And so if you looked at Indigenous ways of knowing, and many of the nations in the Pacific Northwest and Alaska, I would cite as examples because they have such profound knowledge of that natural environment over centuries, since time immemorial, that they know the number of species, the way that things are in the ocean, and the levels of ice. There are many different types of ice. So that knowing actually gives them the knowledge of what is profound in the change, but it's also the relationship of the people to that place in the way that we talked about earlier. So if you're a place-based people and your coastal lands are eroding and flooding, that's something visible. You can see that. The way of life that is attached to that, which has a complexity over centuries, is distilled into one little word in our laws, and that is subsistence lifeways. Mm-hmm. That one word is a composite of everything that we are talking about human consciousness interacting with the consciousness of the earth, the species, the water, the ice. It is an interactive world. And that is something that I don't know exactly how you teach it, But Harriet, when you talk about the satellites and the people who were experimenting, putting themselves into that model, that's the part of imagination, right? Because that is human ingenuity, that is human insight, that is vision, that is originality. I think it was Einstein that basically said that is what enables us to invent, right? That we take that capacity along with our scientific knowledge, and then we invent these things. We're banking on adaptation technology right now to save us from climate crisis. But some of the forms of adaptation that are positive, such as geoengineering, solar, types of blocking, that also has the capacity to jeopardize our health. So the point that I would like to explore with you, Harriet, is how do we bring that space of imagination and knowledge together in a way that is less risky, really, because we have this duty to the planet, to the species, to other people. We really can't afford to step into something that is catastrophic while we are positing this. And that's my fear. So I've opened that space. I hope that makes sense, but that is what I would really love your insight on.
Right. And I want to give the floor to Harriet. I just want to say in the chat, we've had quite a few people expressing a lot of concern about the crisis, that things are so dramatic right now, and what can we really do? So perhaps we can, all three of us, try to hook up our energies between what do we do so we know there are these relationships to the environment in many indigenous communities around the world. We know that some Western-minded people are trying to attune themselves more closely, learn about those cultures and those ways of knowing, but also develop themselves different attunements, different discernments. How do we hook that up to this sense that the world, as we know it, is disappearing this very moment, right? What do each of you do with that sense of pending doom? Would be one way that people feel it, if they don't always use that phrase. And Harriet, I would mention we have several questions also about the background that you've chosen for today. So maybe you could just fill us in on that, and then we'll try to head to that other set of questions.
Oh, I'll see if I could link the two. Thank you. And I think, yeah, tending our minds to that kind of the crisis and the emergency is always incredibly useful. I guess one of the things I would use then is leap off to talk a little bit about this ice cave that I guess I'm kind of virtually sitting in here. So I think one of the reasons that this ice cave has stayed with me as a really, for me, very powerful kind of reminder of the kind of gravity and scale of the issue is you can see the cliff that the ice cave looks out onto kind of here with and what this little line here is a stairway that snakes up the cliff. So this ice cave is an ice cave in the Mer de Glace, one of those kind of classic big alpine glaciers in kind of France, sort of crosses France and Switzerland. So it's one of those kind of classic glaciers as well that has a huge history in the kind of study of glacial science, but also in the evolution of kind of Western ways of representing nature. So it was the space, it was a sort of classic picturesque kind of space. It's also the place where Frankenstein was written. So this glacier has huge amounts of sort of social and cultural kind of baggage that comes with it. There's also a site for the founding of kind of alpine tourism, as well as, of course, now being effectively one of those canary in the coal mine sites where we can visibly see and feel climate change happening in kind of in Europe in particular ways. And so what's the particular significance of this staircase and this ice cave is that every year for centuries, the people of the Chamonix Valley have dug an ice cave on the glacier and held celebrations in it. And traditionally, it would have been dug to hold celebrations to appease the spirits of the glacier and kind of appease the relationship that was seen to be held between the glacier and the devil, and the way that there was a kind of way of kind of making kind of particular kinds of offerings. More recently, it's become a tourist cave and a site of kind of Christmas celebrations. But basically, when they started digging this cave and when it became a tourist destination, you didn't have to come down the staircase and the side of the valley here. The ice sat right up in the valley, and the ice cave sat on top, and you could literally kind of walk off the path into the ice cave. And in the last couple of 100 years, the ice has melted all the way down here, such that you have to come all the way down the staircase. It takes about 20 minutes to get down to the surface of the ice. You literally walk down the kind of effects of climate change in this very kind of embodied experiential way to the surface of the glacier to get into this ice cave, which turns out not to be at all beautiful and sublime, really, but actually mucky and dirty and has this kind of weird blue plastic carpet inside it. So to get back to the kind of point about urgency and kind of question around what does the imagination potentially have to do with kind of questions of emergency and crisis, I think for me, I've been very persuaded by some of the kind of humanities work that's been pointing out that we might understand some of the origins of environmental crisis as in fact a kind of failure of the Western imagination. So a kind of imagination of the Western world that sees a separation between nature and culture, and also an imagination of the Western world that tends to think in everything in terms of the kind of, not necessarily the individual human lifespan, but certainly the time and space span of humankind. So thinking of deep time in human time, in pasts and futures, can sometimes be something that the kind of Western imagination might struggle with. So I've been really persuaded by a lot of humanities scholarship that points this out and says, actually, if we want to think about making people act differently towards the climate, we need to shift our imaginations, with the imagination here being something we have individually, but also a collective sentiment, a shared public structure of feeling, a shared sense of something. And if we can do that, we might be able to bring about change. And I think a really powerful example of that we all, of course, horrifically lived through recently, and obviously for many, we're all still living through in different ways, is the COVID-19 pandemic. When that became constructed as a medical emergency and a social, political, and cultural emergency, action happened. So there's a sort of power there for me about the power of the imagination in kind of shifting how people react to things. And so I'm kind of hopeful that kind of artworks and engaging us with kind of sites powerfully, like this kind of tourist cave that I'm sitting in here, might be one of the ways we start to kind of build new frames for our imagination. And Rebecca, I think the kinds of work you're doing around bringing kind of Indigenous rights and things and thinking into kind of other kinds of legal spaces, in my kind of sense of the world, might be a way of thinking about expanding our legal imaginations in different kinds of ways. But that's the only my projection of my ideas into your work.
Rebecca, go ahead. We would love to learn more about your work.
So Irene, you put a very interesting focus on the question, and I'm not able to see the comments from the audience, but I have a sense that our audience is very sophisticated, knows that there is a crisis, knows that we have to do something, is kind of tired of the talk. And I felt that way when I talked to a colleague of mine that went to the Conference of Parties very recently. And I was so excited because they had just started this fund or whatever. I thought, well, that's historic and something must have happened. But he said, there was a lot of talk and we still don't have any kind of binding emissions, control. So I share with the audience that frustration, like, what do we do? Because we have a crisis. And then we have a lot of talking, and every year it's more talking and more reports, and people decide what's important to screen in or screen out. So let me respond in the context of why I think the intervention of Indigenous peoples as peoples into the Conference of Parties has been very transformative for me as a legal scholar. In 2007, the United Nations agreed by majority consensus in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that Indigenous peoples were peoples with an S, and they had the same rights as all other peoples to self-determination. Why is that important? Because they have been subsumed within nation states basically as ethnic or religious minorities with a very small set of quote unquote cultural rights, like maybe language rights or something of that nature, but without the acknowledgement of that autonomy right that is a political and moral right under international law. And for Indigenous peoples, the relationship with place, as we talked about, is pivotal. In international law, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, a people is defined in relationship to its territory, its right to exercise autonomy on its territory. For Indigenous peoples, they're still within the nation states. They don't have the right to secede under the declaration. It's not a treaty yet. It's a prescriptive document, but it doesn't want to dismantle the boundaries of the nation states. But it calls upon the nation states to actually engage with Indigenous peoples to protect their lands, their territories, their cultures, their ways of being. And that is the agency that they are taking into the climate meetings, that they have the right to a sense of participatory inclusion into the decision-making apparatus, even though they're not state parties, and they cannot be state parties under the UN structure, but yet they are peoples with this very deep and long-standing relationship to their traditional territories. And by virtue of that right, they can show up and express what ought to be done in relationship to protecting those territories. I have been struck by the way in which, for example, Indigenous nations in the United States who were part of Canada and reciprocal First Nations in the Canada who are part of the larger people who are now partially in the United States as trans-border communities. They are weighing in about the rights that should attach to the earth and the species within that. That rights framework is not of their choosing. Many times their own languages or epistemologies would call for relational, descriptions about, kin or something of this nature. But the rights framework of Western law is very dominant, and that's why corporations have rights. So Indigenous peoples are asserting the right to protect the lands and environments as peoples, as trans-border communities, with that knowledge, with that agency. So I personally think that is a very powerful movement forward.
Absolutely. And I think the recent decision about deconstruction, degrowth is a term that we wanted to make sure we talked about here today as well, on the Klamath River to take down the dams so that the Indigenous people could reconstruct their relationship to the salmon, which is an essential part of their way of living. I think that was a tiny light of hope that things can change. At least I would like to be hopeful about that. So I'm going to be a little bit provocative here, and I want to try to pick up what you just said, Rebecca, because it strikes me that on the one hand, there is some hope to be seen in Indigenous peoples being able to assert their very different relationship to place, that could cause some changes like taking down of dams or like, unfortunately, moving villages we've heard about recently because of the permafrost melting. What would happen if we also thought about the next generation as having a set of rights? I think we're seeing afoot in the world that young people realize how threatened they are by climatic changes, by loss of biodiversity, and they as a group are pushing back in ways that are unheard of. And this is also transnational or global or international, depending on the term that you'd like to use. Would either of you like to comment on what is that force that young people are bringing in across the world to our need to do something, right? Our need to think differently, our need perhaps to imagine a future where humans play a very different role from the role that they play right now. I know you both work with young people because you're both in the classroom. Harriet, do you want to pick that up?
I can pick it up in a kind of, I guess, a kind of start point maybe, and say that I think I'm I feel very lucky, and I'm constantly inspired by the students I get to work with in my classroom. So we just launched a new program, kind of Global Social Futures, as a kind of umbrella term for thinking about kind of a whole range of different kind of environmental and social issues kind of pulling together. And I think one of the things that's really extraordinary about the people who come and kind of join that course and other kinds of courses, whether at undergraduate or master's level, that we offer in geography is how much passion they bring to the subject. So it's really brilliant to kind of be in a kind of classroom and have people who've been experts in kind of have already gone and done work during their gap year on kind of alternative uses of fungi as kind of fabric, for example, or different kinds of energy, kind of different sorts of technologies for kind of local energy production. And this is the kind of work people are kind of coming into the classroom as undergrad and postgrad students already having done in the world. And I think the kind of combination that brings between some of the kinds of discussions and kind of book-based learning that we might bring into them in our reading lists, together with the kinds of worldly practice that they have, brings a kind of real energy to some of the discussions we're having, and kind of really changes the tenor in ways that I think is kind of really useful for thinking through the kind of sharp end of these challenges about not only theorizing living sustainably, but actually kind of going out there and doing it.
Rebecca, do you want to?
So I agree that the youth movement globally is very powerful in the conversation about the climate crisis. The young people truly do get that it is a crisis, and they feel like they're going to be saddled with the worst effects of that. And they're absolutely right about that. So they have a power and an agency internationally. And I love how they come together in an intercultural way. That generation really, they learn easily from each other. They have these apps, they communicate, they are informed by the different cultures and places that they're from. So I find that very uplifting. I also want to say, in response to your comment, Irene, that when we're framing kind of what are the rights of future generations, we fell short. I think when the conversation at Rio happened in 1992, and there was the Brundtland report on sustainable development, there was an idea that it's development that meets current needs but doesn't jeopardize the needs of future generations, right? That we had to think intergenerationally. Somehow that dropped off and became a conversation about common but differentiated responsibility between the developed countries and the developing countries, which still allowed some greenhouse gas development, but just in different scales. And I think that conversation is the one that got us off track, because if in fact this is an Earth that belongs to the future generations, then all we have the capacity to do is to steward that and to safeguard it, because that is theirs. And that is the thinking of the 7 generations concept that many Indigenous peoples have spoken to. Oren Lyons most famously spoke to it in the 1990s in those UN conversations. But thinking for the 7th generation was built into many Indigenous systems of thought. And I think that we sidestep that today in our global and national policy making, and the young people are getting us more attuned to that.
That's very helpful to frame it that way, and to remind us to some of the history and where we might have taken false steps. So, Harriet, how do artists help us get back on track? Can you share with us an example of an active, creative energy that really helped you see that artists are not somehow secondary to this discussion? They are the geniuses of the imagination, and that's precisely what we need right now, is to imagine new futures, right? Imagine anew the future of the Earth. Is there a particular artistic project that helped you see this is not tangential, but central?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question, and a really, really important one, especially when we're thinking through this value of the kind of humanities for humans, and obviously in this case, the arts. I think, I guess one example I'd use that I think really powerfully showed me not just how it can kind of evolve the arts can help us evolve new imaginations, but also bring together kind of lots of different, sometimes very disparate stakeholders in these discussions. Because obviously we know that some of the challenges sometimes with some of these kind of coming together to work on these issues is that sense of just kind of the different knowledge structures we have, the different ways of working we have. And one of my kind of collaborators is a geographer and a performance artist, Cecilia Sachs-Olsen, co-curated with a group of architects and critics in 2019, the Oslo Architecture Triennale, using under the phrase degrowth, which obviously we kind of talked through a bit earlier with the kind of example of the kind of de-damming of rivers. But in that context, what they meant by degrowth was a sense of kind of challenge architects, urban planners, and the kind of built environment industry with what does it mean to kind of be an architect, be an urban planner, and pursue strategies of degrowth. And what they did was kind of recognize that degrowth can be quite a radical idea that can feel quite alien, quite abstract from how kind of capitalist organizations and kind of urban planners do business as usual. So what they were interested in doing is using the sort of innovative and sometimes slightly playful force of performance art and live art and installation to kind of effectively bring these groups into conversation with some of these radical ideas, but raise them and get everybody thinking anew about them. And it wasn't an event without controversy. It wasn't an event without challenge. But I think what it did do was show me the power of not only the building of these new imaginations, but also what can happen when you bring sometimes quite disparate bodies of people together to kind of think these things through and kind of come up with sort of potentially quite radical new solutions and new ways of thinking. Sure, none of this stuff's been built yet, but what it did do was start to kind of open up some of those possibilities and trajectories. And I think that's really, really valuable.
Mm-hmm. So the power of words is something all three of us keep coming back to, right? So just even coining or saying out loud yourself the word degrowth, right? When we've had growth pounded into us for quite a long time now, that can be helpful, as can trying to think anew about sustainability, right? I know, Rebecca, that's something you've thought about quite a bit. What are some of the projects or issues related to sustainability that you wish we had more in our minds at this moment?
So that's a great question, and I'll just take a short slice because I'm in the desert Southwest where we're in a water crisis. That's our current climate crisis. The Colorado River doesn't have enough water to serve all of the property interests that draw from that. And so the vision of the Colorado River in Arizona is one of consumptive use. The river is serving all of these people in their property rights, whether that's agriculture or industry or mining or whatever the case may be. And so what do we do to create a better governance framework? Right now, the conversation is somebody going to sue somebody? That's not a productive framing, right? That's not productive at all. The river is a living entity. It has a right to survive. It needs water to survive. People can't be drawing from the river. So there's, for the first time, a discussion in my time of being here. The first discussion is, how do we create a new governance structure that is going to even recognize that the river has its own essence and life and framework? And there, I think what the Maori people did in New Zealand was incredibly important, because they had a name and a personification for the river. The parliament recognized the river in that personhood. And my understanding is that they've appointed essentially stewards to argue about what the river needs as a first principle. And then people could take what they need in their communities. Because right now we're in that overuse model. We're in the growth model, the 19th century, use it or lose it, prior appropriation, put your water to beneficial use. That model is going to be fatal to us as a desert society with the Colorado River in the condition that it's in. So that is the conversation. I think it is a local conversation. I think the fact that there are 30 tribal governments in the Colorado River Basin with probably up to 50% of the rights to the river are tribal rights, that is making that conversation happen. What governance structure will we create? We have the capacity to do something differently now. Will we do it?
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think this ties in really beautifully to some of the thrusts of Harriet's work, because artists can help us imagine that the river has rights, right? So for those of us who don't live in that place, art could transport us there, or could create a context in which we could understand the rights of entities other than corporations or nation states or individuals. So that seems a wonderful way to bring the thrust of both of your work together. We're in the waning moments of our time together. And I would love to first just ask each of you if there was one particular point you came in wanting to make sure you made today that you haven't had a chance to make yet. Harriet, is there something you wanted to share that you didn't get a chance to share just yet?
Well, not really, but I just think I've been really, really inspired listening to kind of Rebecca kind of talk through a number of those examples about kind of thinking through rights for kind of other sorts of entities. And I think that really makes me think really, I really love the vision of kind of environmental and climate justice that gives us, and makes us really think about the kind of expansive understanding of justice that we then need to bring to those kinds of questions, environmental justice, for what, for whom, in kind of what sorts of times and spaces. And I think that's just really, really fascinating. So thank you.
Great. And Rebecca, did you have a last example or phrase? I'm so glad climate justice got put out there. I think that's what the folks in Montreal, Canada are talking about right now, right? Do other species have the right for climate justice? Rebecca, your thoughts?
Absolutely. I agree with Harriet that whole conversation about justice, which we could talk about at length for another hour, because it's distributive, it's reparative, it encompasses the concept of equity, which is very contested. So with a space holder there for the next hour in which we could be together, I want to comment on the importance of thinking about resilience. So we've talked about sustainability, but I think it's very important to think about resilience. And the way that science defines that is the capacity of a community or an organization or whatever to come back into balance after a very traumatic, jarring event that changes its character. And when you think about resilient societies, Indigenous peoples are the most resilient societies on the planet. They still have intact knowledge systems that date back many, many years, and they have been through traumatic events and have, in a sense, adapted to the current condition. The justice inquiry says, what are we doing now? The Indigenous community has already had to relocate. They've already had to give up their land. They've already had to give up water. Are we requiring another level of impact? And is that just? That's the justice discussion. The other discussion is to say they have embodied their life ways, their cultures over time in a way that models Indigenous resilience, Indigenous sustainability, which is systems that are in balance, practices that serve intergenerational needs in place. That's Article 25 of the UN Declaration, that spiritual relationship to place over time. We can learn from them, but we also have to honor the fact that they have given so much and make sure that what is left is under their governance and control at this last juncture in climate policy. There is a profound connection between resilience and well-being, and health equity is built into that. And I think the Inuit leader, Sheila Watt-Cloutier, spoke to that so beautifully at the UN when she basically says, you know, our culture, our way of life, our subsistence is all wrapped up in this place. She says, It is a right to health, and it is a right to a livable environment, to food, to water, to all that helps a human community thrive and live. Who has the right to take that away from any Indigenous community? And that is why I'm very passionate about my topic, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, but it is in support of those leaders, those peoples, and their knowledge in place that I am here today doing the work that I do. So thank you.
And I thank you both so much for sharing. And I would just put you on the hot seat one more time to say, there is so much desperation, there is so much sadness, so much depression out there about the lack of adequate attention on the part of industry, on the part of government, on the part of world bodies to the future of the earth. If you had one or two things to say to folks about why we need to keep carrying on, why we need not to give up hope, what would you want to say? Is it foolish to hope that we can turn this around? Not turn around is maybe the wrong metaphor, because we've already done certain kinds of damage, as Harriet has pointed out with the glaciers and Rebecca with the Colorado River. We've already done certain kinds of damage that we cannot reverse. But can we stop in our tracks and do some kinds of things to prevent catastrophic damage that does eliminate the possibility of life on Earth? Is there something that connects today to that future that's looking not so far away right now, where everything is irreversible?
I guess if I can start, what is obviously a really big and very difficult question for a hot seat final topic. I think it would be quite sad to think that hope could be foolish, but I think equally it might be foolish to think that hope was enough. And that actually kind of trying to marshal all the tools in our individual, collective, global toolboxes, whether that's from the arts and humanities, whether that's kind of respectfully engaging and learning from Indigenous knowledge systems, as Rebecca has so powerfully and eloquently kind of offered us the kind of direction towards. I think these are things that we can do, but we need to be doing it, and we need to be doing everything that we can. And we need to hope. We also need to be ensuring that hope is directed towards action, I think.
Right. So hope's not enough. We need to act. Rebecca?
So I think it's a beautiful question, and it's a profound question. And I want to use just a little snapshot. I have a wonderful colleague at the University of Arizona. He's part of the new Indigenous Resilience Center, Dr. Michael Katutua Johnson, who, in addition to being a scientist, he's also a traditional Hopi farmer. And he always differentiates that concept of hope, which is that kind of aspirational maybe, with the concept of faith, the way that he knows it. And the Hopi people are dry farmers, right? There's very little rain. They plant this corn and they have faith, he says, that it will grow under these conditions. And the faith is based on that relationship to place over time in a sacred way, where you have faith that the earth will regenerate. The catastrophic part of human caused climate is that there's a hubris in it, right? Because in a sense, the earth can just wipe everything out immediately. And some dams have come down, not because anybody made them, but because they just burst. And it is amazing how fast the environment that was there before the dam regenerates. The earth has a tremendous regenerative power, and there is an agency that is quite separate and apart from human beings that, in a sense, ensures earth justice the way that I believe it.
Wonderful. I don't think I can add anything to what either of you has just said. We could go on for hours and hours. Unfortunately, we cannot, because our audience, many of them need to get back to their jobs or onto their dinner times or onto their breakfast time even. I do want to thank you both from the bottom of my heart. This was such a meaningful conversation, and I feel so lucky to have met all of you and been able to bring you to other people you might not have encountered otherwise. My huge thanks to 1014 Space for Ideas and to the de Gruyter Foundation for funding Humanities for Humans. I want our audience to please not forget that we hope to be talking about growing inequity in social, healthcare, economics, of course, in another online chat. And also on May 10th, there will be an in-person conversation about repair, reparation, and refusal. So please look to the 1014 website for both of those. I think it wouldn't be wrong to cite one of the few wise men from Western culture, Voltaire, who tells us in Candide that we have to cultivate our gardens, right? So I hope that each of you will look around you and see what you can cultivate in your garden. Thank you so much to the audience for being here. This will be put online, and I hope that teachers, individuals will think of it as a resource. Harriet and Rebecca, what a joy to have met you. Thank you so very, very much.